There's a phrase U.S. Central Command used to describe part of this operation: cutting off the head of the snake. It sounds like something out of a movie trailer, but it's the actual language the Pentagon put out. And once you look at what that strike really did, you start to understand why people online keep calling this the day America wiped out Iran's entire military brain. In this video, I want to walk through exactly what was hit, who didn't survive it, what Iran managed to rebuild in the months since, and where things actually stand right now, in the middle of July. Because the short version everyone's repeating on social media isn't wrong, exactly. It's just missing almost everything that makes this story worth understanding. I've pulled this together from Pentagon statements, wire service reporting, and outlets that specialize in tracking Iran's internal politics day to day. So let's get into it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran. The opening hours of that operation weren't primarily about bombing missile silos or grounding the Air Force. The first priority was leadership, the people who actually run Iran's military, sitting at their desks and in their compounds. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in a strike on his compound in Tehran that day. He had held the position, and with it, ultimate command over Iran's armed forces, for close to 37 years, since 1989. He was 86 years old, and reporting at the time described several members of his inner circle dying alongside him. He wasn't the only senior figure removed from the board that day. Iran's state media itself confirmed the deaths of Abdulrahim Mousavi, chief of staff of the country's armed forces, and Aziz Nasirzadeh, the defense minister and a former Air Force commander. Mohammad Pakpour, who had only taken over as head of the Revolutionary Guards the previous June after his predecessor was killed in an earlier round of fighting, was killed as well. Ali Shamkhani, a longtime and deeply trusted advisor to Khamenei, who had survived plenty of close calls over the years, died in the same wave of strikes. Sit with that list for a second. In a single day, Iran lost its supreme leader and commander-in-chief, the chief of staff of its entire armed forces, the head of its most powerful paramilitary organization, its defense minister, and one of its most senior political fixers. That isn't a partial hit on a chain of command. That's close to the entire top of it, gone within the same 24 hours. The physical infrastructure took damage too, not just the people running it, you. Central Command said it had struck and destroyed the Revolutionary Guard's own headquarters. That's the strike where officials used the head of the snake language. Israeli forces separately reported hitting dozens of other command centers, including facilities tied to intelligence, missile and drone operations, and internal security. Trump also stated publicly that American strikes had destroyed Iran's naval headquarters and sunk multiple vessels in the same window. To understand why analysts keep reaching for words like unprecedented, it helps to picture what a single day like that actually looks like from inside a government. Normally, when a senior official dies, even suddenly, even in office, there's a process. There's a deputy already handling parts of the job. There are protocols for transferring authority, briefings that get handed over, secure communications that keep functioning while the paperwork catches up. What happened on February 28th didn't leave room for any of that, because it wasn't one official dying. It was the entire top layer of a national military disappearing within hours of each other, in some cases from the same strike package hitting connected locations across Tehran. Whatever contingency planning existed on paper was about to be tested in the worst possible way, all at once, with no warning, and with the rest of the world watching in real time as the news broke. This wasn't actually the first time Washington had tried a strategy like this against Iran, and the history is worth knowing because it shapes how you should read everything that came after February. Back in January 2020, a single American strike killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard's Quds force, and probably the single most influential figure in Iran's regional strategy at that point, a man who'd spent 2 decades building personal relationships with militias across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. His replacement, Esmail Qani, inherited a network that had been built almost entirely on Soleimani's own individual credibility. Analysts spent years afterward debating whether anyone could really hold that kind of informal relationship-based system together without the same personal history behind it. This time, the US and Israel didn't just remove one man at the top of one branch. They went after the supreme leader, the chief of staff, the guards commander, and the defense minister all at once. A much bigger version of the same underlying bet, that if you take out enough of the actual human relationships holding a command structure together, the structure itself stops functioning, even if new names get slotted into the org chart within days. Within roughly 10 days, US. Central Command's own count of targets struck across Iran had reportedly climbed past several thousand, alongside dozens of Iranian naval vessels damaged or destroyed. That pace, hundreds of targets a day, sustained across an entire country, tells you this campaign was built around speed, hit the leadership and its supporting infrastructure fast enough, and there's no time for anyone to organize an orderly handover in between. Here's where the story stops being a simple, we destroyed their brain narrative, because Iran didn't just collapse into chaos with no plan for what comes next. Multiple wire service reports, citing sources close to the guards themselves, describe an organization that had anticipated exactly this kind of decapitation strike well before it happened and had built a resilience plan around the possibility. According to that reporting, senior figures throughout the command structure had named successors several ranks deep. So if a commander was killed, there wasn't one backup waiting. There were several, already briefed and ready to step into the role without needing new orders from a hierarchy that had just been shattered. There's also a structural layer to how the guards operate that goes beyond simply naming backup officers. Each military commander in the organization is paired with a political officer, essentially an ideological and administrative counterpart who reports independently up toward the supreme leader's office. When a commander is killed, that parallel structure keeps functioning, coordinating while a military successor gets slotted in. It also serves another purpose during a crisis like this one, keeping rank and file troops ideologically committed to the fight even after the people who recruited and trained them are suddenly gone. That function tends to matter far more in a moment like this than during ordinary peacetime, when routine and material incentives alone are usually enough to hold a military together. Within roughly a week, an interim leadership council took charge on a temporary basis. Then, in early March, Iran's assembly of experts formally installed Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the new supreme leader, a figure widely described by analysts as more hardline and more closely aligned with the Guards than his father had been. Leading the Revolutionary Guards itself was Ahmad Vahidi, a veteran hardliner with a long history in the organization, dating back to its founding era, who state media confirmed as the new commander-in-chief on March 1st. This is the part of the story that cuts against the simple idea that killing enough leaders automatically weakens a military. Multiple reports describe how, even before the war, the Guards had already been restructuring themselves into something closer to a set of semi-autonomous regional commands, each answering more directly to the Supreme Leader's office rather than routing everything through a single central headquarters in Tehran that could be, and was, taken out in one strike. In effect, Iran had already started converting its military from one central brain running everything through a single nervous system into something closer to a decentralized network of smaller, more independent brains, each capable of operating if the center got hit. That shift carries real, documented downsides too, and not all of them favor the countries that carried out the strikes. Analysts who track the Guards closely have pointed out that this same decentralization, giving mid-level regional commanders far more autonomy to make their own calls without waiting on Tehran, raises the risk of miscalculation. A mid-ranking commander with real authority and a personal grudge, or simply poor judgment under pressure, can order an escalatory strike without the centralized restraint that used to run through the capital first. Hezbollah's experience is a useful preview of exactly this dynamic because Iran essentially ran the same playbook there first. After Israel killed Hezbollah's longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah, along with a string of senior commanders back in 2024, the Guards didn't simply let the group limp along with a hollowed-out command structure. Iranian officers reportedly stepped directly into the gaps, temporarily plugging Iranian personnel into Hezbollah's chain of command while rebuilding its internal structure from the ground up, specifically to close the intelligence vulnerabilities that had let Israel locate and kill so many of its leaders in the first place. That rebuild apparently worked well enough that Hezbollah was able to re-enter the fight on Iran's side once this current war broke out, firing missiles into Israel and triggering a renewed Israeli ground campaign in southern Lebanon. So the Guards had already run a live trial of rebuilding a decapitated command structure once, on a smaller ally, before they had to do it for themselves. It's a reasonable bet that a lot of what worked in that Hezbollah rebuild informed how quickly Iran's own leadership was reconstituted after February 28th. Killing the brain, in other words, didn't produce a body with no head. It produced something closer to several smaller, harder-to-predict heads, arguably a messier outcome from a security standpoint, even if it looked like a clean battlefield win in the moment it happened. There's also a quieter, longer-running shift that's genuinely important for understanding Iran today. Multiple outlets tracking the country's internal politics describe a system that had been dominated by clerical authority, where ultimate power ran through the supreme leader as a religious figure first, moving towards something much more dominated by the Guards as an institution, regardless of who technically holds the top title. Civilian leadership, including figures within Iran's own elected government, has reportedly been increasingly sidelined from real wartime decision-making as this has played out. Analysis of Iran's internal structure has described the shift as one from a clear hierarchy towards something more fragmented and decentralized, with the Guards now sitting at the real center of gravity. There's public friction visible from this too. Iran's foreign ministry has drawn criticism from state media at home over statements seen as accidentally handing Washington a rhetorical win. Exactly the kind of internal noise you'd expect from a government where several competing power centers are jostling for control of the narrative, rather than one clear chain of command speaking with a single voice. All of this is playing out against a brutal economic backdrop. Iranian officials have put total war damage in the range of hundreds of billions of dollars, a figure that comes startlingly close to the country's entire annual economic output. Inflation has been running well above 50% in recent readings, with some projections suggesting it could climb higher before the year is out. That's the kind of pressure that would test a fully intact, unified government under normal circumstances. Iran is trying to manage it with a supreme leader who's been in the job less than half a year, a Guards leadership that's already lost its top commander at least once, and a foreign ministry that's been publicly criticized by the country's own state media. A functioning centralized government is usually the institution that absorbs and manages exactly this kind of economic shock, coordinating subsidies, currency interventions, and rationing. Iran is trying to do that with the very institution that was the primary target of the war in the first place. The leadership losses didn't stop with that opening week in February. In mid-June, Israeli strikes reportedly killed roughly 20 more senior Iranian military figures in a single day, again hitting Guards commanders specifically, some with decades of service dating back to the earliest years of the Islamic Republic. Groups that track Iran's internal military structure noted that the replacement officers brought in after February generally carried similar dual backgrounds to their predecessors, experience in both Iran's conventional military and the more ideologically driven Guards, which suggests Iran has a genuinely deep bench of experienced officers to draw from, even after repeated waves of losses. There was also a wave of unconfirmed reports in early June claiming that Ahmad Vahidi himself, the man who'd stepped up to lead the Guards after Pakpour's death, had been killed in a Tehran strike. Pro-Israel accounts and Iranian opposition channels spread the claim aggressively at the time, and for a few days it genuinely wasn't clear whether Iran had lost its top uniformed Guards commander twice within the same war. That particular claim turned out to be false, or at least premature. Vahidi appeared publicly on July 3rd at Khamenei's funeral ceremony in Tehran, the first time he'd been seen in public since the war began, putting the earlier rumors to rest, at least for now. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Even something as basic as whether a top commander is alive isn't always settled quickly in a conflict this murky, and rumors of decapitation strikes have circulated more than once without turning out to be accurate. The international response in the days after February 28th split along fairly predictable lines, but it's worth walking through because it shapes how much diplomatic room Iran has had to maneuver since. Washington and Israeli officials framed the operation as a decisive blow against a regime that had spent decades funding proxy militias and pushing toward a weapons-capable nuclear program. President Trump publicly called for regime change in the hours after the strikes, encouraging ordinary Iranians to move against their own government while the leadership vacuum was still fresh. Russia moved quickly to request an emergency session of the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors, framing the strikes as an attack on facilities that were technically still under international safeguards. That diplomatic maneuvering mattered less for its immediate practical effect than for what it signaled major powers outside the U.S. Israel Axis were treating this as a serious violation worth putting on the record internationally, even if none of them had the leverage to reverse what had already happened. Inside Iran itself, the reaction was messier than a simple show of national unity. Human rights monitoring groups reported well over 100 civilian deaths in the opening days, including a strike that hit a girls' school in southern Iran. At the same time, reporting from inside the country described genuinely mixed public reactions to Khamenei's death specifically. Scattered celebrations in some neighborhoods alongside organized mourning gatherings in others, which tells you something about how divided ordinary Iranians already were on the regime, well before any of this started. Iran's president at the time, Masoud Pezeshkian, described the killing as a declaration of open war and vowed retaliation, language that set the tone for the missile and drone exchanges that followed in the following weeks. Regionally, the shockwaves spread fast. Protesters clashed with security forces near Baghdad's Green Zone within days of Khamenei's death, a reminder that Iran's influence over neighboring political systems didn't simply evaporate because its own leadership had been hit. Hezbollah's re-entry into the fighting out of Lebanon and the renewed Israeli ground campaign that followed in the south of the country showed that a war aimed at Iran's command structure was never going to stay contained inside Iran's own borders. It's worth pausing on the legal and ethical argument running underneath all of this, because it hasn't gone away just because the war has dragged on for months. Striking a sitting head of state directly sits in a genuinely contested space under international law. Some European officials argued early on that preventive strikes like the ones that opened this war don't meet the legal bar international law generally sets, which requires an actual imminent threat rather than a longer-term strategic concern about weapons development or regional influence. Legal scholars have made similar arguments, saying that decapitating a government's leadership this way blurs the line between a military operation and something closer to a targeted assassination campaign against an entire chain of command. Other voices, including American officials and parts of Iran's own domestic opposition, have argued the opposite, that removing a leadership responsible for both an accelerating nuclear program and years of proxy warfare across the region was not just legally defensible, but overdue. That debate isn't settled, and it isn't going to be settled in this video. Serious people on both sides are still actively arguing about it. It's worth zooming out even further than the Soleimani comparison, because decapitation strategy isn't a new idea in warfare, and militaries have tried versions of it against all kinds of adversaries for decades with wildly mixed results. Israel's own history offers a useful contrast. Targeted killings of Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders in Gaza over the years have occasionally disrupted specific attack planning in the short term, but those organizations have generally regenerated leadership within months, in part because they were built from the start around distributed cells rather than a single centralized command post. The same pattern showed up with al-Qaeda after Osama bin Laden's death in 2011. The organization lost its founding figure and symbolic center of gravity, but regional affiliates kept operating with only modest disruption, because so much of the group's actual operational capacity had already migrated outward to franchises in Yemen, North Africa, and elsewhere long before bin Laden was killed. Contrast that with cases where decapitation strikes did produce something closer to genuine collapse. The Israeli strikes against Hezbollah's top leadership in 2024 came closer to a real structural crisis for that organization, at least temporarily, precisely because Hezbollah at the time still leaned more heavily on a handful of irreplaceable senior figures with unique institutional knowledge and personal networks that had taken decades to build. That's part of why Iran moved so aggressively to prop up Hezbollah's chain of command from the outside afterward. The group's own internal redundancy wasn't yet strong enough to absorb the loss on its own. Iran's Revolutionary Guard sit somewhere between these examples, and arguably closer to the al-Qaeda pattern than the Hezbollah one, precisely because of the redundancy this video has been describing. The layered successors, the parallel political officer network, the semi-autonomous regional structure that predates this war. That's the core reason a strike this comprehensive produced adaptation rather than collapse. It also raises an uncomfortable question for anyone hoping a single dramatic operation could functionally end a 50,000-strong institution with its own founding mythology and internal training pipeline. What would it actually take to break an organization like that permanently, rather than just forcing it to reorganize under new names? Based on the historical pattern, the honest answer looks like sustained pressure over years, not a single operation, however well executed. In the middle of July, roughly 4.5 months after that opening strike, the honest answer is that it's genuinely hard to pin down from the outside. And that's sort of the whole point of this story. Mojtaba Khamenei holds the Supreme Leader title and, with it, nominal command. But multiple reports describe real operational authority sitting increasingly with the Guards as an institution, and specifically with hardline factions inside it, some of which have reportedly been pushing to marginalize civilian officials and resist compromise with Washington. So was Iran's military brain obliterated? I think the honest answer is that the phrase is true and seriously incomplete at the same time, and both of those things can be true without contradicting each other. It's absolutely accurate that the United States and Israel carried out one of the most thorough command and control decapitation strikes against a modern military in decades, killing a sitting head of state who also served as commander-in-chief, along with his chief of staff, his top paramilitary commander, and his defense minister, all within a single day, while also physically destroying the Guard's own headquarters and multiple other command centers. That's not a symbolic or cosmetic achievement. It's a genuine structural blow to how a country runs its military, and it doesn't get nearly enough credit as a pure operational feat. If you told a defense analyst 5 years ago that a single day of strikes would remove a supreme leader, an armed forces chief of staff, a top paramilitary commander, and a defense minister simultaneously, most of them would have called that an almost impossibly ambitious target list. But obliterated implies something got permanently switched off, and what actually happened looks more like something got forcibly rewired instead. Iran had already planned for a scenario like this. It had successors lined up several ranks deep for its senior figures. It had already started pushing command authority out to semi-autonomous regional structures before the war even began. The brain didn't go dark. It fractured into smaller, more independent, and arguably less predictable pieces. Vahidi stepping into the top Guard's role within days, surviving to this day despite repeated rumors of his death, and remaining visibly active at the highest levels, tells you the succession planning worked, at least in the short term. And the broader shift toward a flatter Guards-dominated structure with more moderate civilian voices sidelined along the way might genuinely make Iran a harder actor to predict and negotiate with going forward, not an easier one. That's arguably the opposite of what a clean decapitation strike is usually supposed to achieve strategically. A negotiating partner with one clear voice at the top, even a hostile one, is generally easier to reach a deal with than a fragmented structure where it isn't always obvious who actually has the authority to sign off on anything. It's also worth sitting with the human scale of this for a second, separate from the strategic chess piece framing. We're talking about a head of state, a defense minister, a chief of staff of an entire armed forces, and dozens of senior officers, many with decades of service going back to the earliest years of the Islamic Republic, removed from the chain of command within the span of a few months. Militaries aren't just org charts. They run on relationships, trust between officers, and years of operational experience that doesn't transfer instantly to a replacement, even a well-prepared one, several ranks down the succession list. You can refill a title in a week. You can't rebuild decades of institutional trust nearly as fast, and that slower, less visible cost is exactly the part of this story that a phrase like obliterated tends to erase. There's also a decent historical case for expecting this kind of outcome if you zoom out far enough. Decapitation strikes against militant and state actors have a long, genuinely mixed track record. The pattern that shows up again and again in military analysis is that removing top leadership works best against tightly centralized organizations built around a single irreplaceable figure, and works far less reliably against organizations that are ideologically driven, institutionally deep, and built with redundancy in mind from the start. The Revolutionary Guards check almost every box in that second category. A large, institutionally deep organization with its own ideological training pipeline, its own parallel political officer network, its own succession planning baked in at every level, and a founding identity that predates any single man who died on February 28th. Hitting an organization like that with a decapitation strategy can absolutely disrupt it in the short term, and clearly did here. But the historical base rate for that kind of strike-producing permanent structural collapse, rather than a faster, more decentralized reconstitution, isn't great. And this war, so far, looks like it's tracking closer to the second pattern than the first. None of that is an argument that the strikes weren't significant, or that Iran walked away from February 28th unscathed. It clearly didn't. It's an argument that obliterated brain, something switched off and gone, undersells what's actually a messier, and in some ways more consequential, outcome. A military that lost an entire generation of senior leadership and adapted around that loss faster than most standard models of organizational collapse would have predicted. Where this goes next is genuinely an open question, and I'll keep tracking it as the situation develops. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments which part of this conflict you'd want unpacked next. A lot of what ends up in these videos starts from exactly that kind of conversation.